The interview that NBC did with me is out, and it is a huge disappointment, completely underwhelming, a textbook example of gaslighting, and not even all factually accurate. What can I say? I am sorry for all of us, but I am going to walk you through it and show you where it really is leaning on the coverage, where it really isn't being objective, and where it is even being factually inaccurate. And then I'm going to show you what I had hoped the interview would be, which was an exploration of the issue. I went into NBC and I talked to them at length. We talked about my background and how I came to this issue and the documentary that I made, and also about the actual security of the voting machines. We talked about the data, about the research, the actual court case, and they didn't use any of that. The only thing they used was one soundbite from me. They needed me to tell them one thing. I'm going to play it for you.
Plaintiffs in the suit, including Lulu Friesdat and her team at Smart Elections, which calls itself a nonpartisan election reform group, say they want a full recount in Rockland County, an hour north of New York City, citing alleged irregularities with some districts that logged hundreds of votes for Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, but zero for then Vice President Kamala Harris.
The narrative in 2020 is that in 2020, the Stop the Steal people said this absolutely happened. The election was absolutely rigged. We're not saying that. We're saying that the results look unusual, irregular, and we would like some hand counts to look into it. That is what they needed me to say. That is why they called me. That was why they asked me to go in. They wanted me, and I'm not saying that I was trapped into saying this or anything. I said this of my own free will, but apparently this is the soundbite they were looking for, is me saying, we're not saying that the elections were rigged. That is the only soundbite that they used from our entire interview. But the really interesting data that came out of this piece is this.
The poll shows 41% of people who voted for Harris say the president did not legitimately win the 2024 election. That same poll we showed earlier reveals 70% of Trump voters still believe Biden didn't legitimately win in 2020.
That is interesting data. 41% of Harris voters and 70% of Trump voters do not believe the election results. And if you do the math on that, that is 53% of registered voters. 53%. Let that sink in. 53% of registered voters do not believe one of the last two presidential elections. And yet, the NBC piece minimizes all of that concern and just assures us over and over again that experts say there's nothing to see here, move along. And so because of that, we're actually going to name this particular program. We have a special title for it, and our title for this program is You Are Not Crazy, You Are Being Gaslit. And in honor of recognizance, we have this for you, a little video that we made.
Stay hopeful, trust your gut, and always know you're not crazy.
You are not crazy. You are being gaslit. And I am going to show you how now. So here's the piece, and we're going to go through it. I'm going to start and stop it a little bit as I play it and just sort of lay out the ways in which I think it is really particularly biased. Here we go.
There's a corner of the internet where the 2024 election is not over.
Okay, let's just start with that. There is a corner of the internet. Okay, 53% of registered voters is not a corner of the internet. That is more than half of registered voters who are not convinced that the elections are accurate. Okay, gaslight number one.
November 2024 contest raises a lot of serious questions.
And even though Democratic leadership doesn't want any part of it,
we accept the choice the country made.
Some voters aren't giving up.
The first domino is about to fall.
Right, so we're going to push our feelings aside and understand this is statistically unlikely.
This ain't no conspiracy theory.
If the rhetoric from those voters sounds familiar,
frankly, we did win this election.
It sounds a lot like President Trump after he lost in 2020.
To do it, they cheated and they rigged our presidential election.
Just this time from some on the left. And the feeling may be more than just the vibes from an online fringe, even as Kamala Harris herself.
Okay, there's another one, online fringe. Just keep noticing the little terms that they're dropping that are making you feel embarrassed about the questions that you're asking. The entire point of gaslighting someone is to make them feel ashamed, to make them feel like they've done something wrong and that they really shouldn't be behaving this way. We're not supposed to be asking these questions. That's what this type of language is supposed to tell us.
Quickly stamped out any conspiracies after her loss.
When we lose an election, we accept the results.
A recent poll shows 41% of people who voted for Harris say the president did not legitimately win the 2024 election. The poll didn't ask why they thought it wasn't legitimate. The House's top Democrat this week responding to our questions about this emerging election denial.
Not a single Democrat, as far as I can tell, challenged the certification because we're not election deniers. And obviously, we've seen very different behavior from the other side of the aisle.
Okay, that soundbite even is not completely accurate because there have been a couple Congress people who have pushed back on the election results. Dan Goldman, who is a former prosecutor, actually posted on X that he thought there needed to be an investigation after Trump made comments about the voting machines in Pennsylvania. And Jasmine Crockett, who's also a congressional rep, has been very vocal about her doubts about the results of the 2024 election. And so that statement that they're featuring there, again, not completely accurate.
Those voters, though, latching on to a little-known lawsuit out of New York.
I don't think you could really call the Rockland County lawsuit a little-known lawsuit at this point. A lot of people have heard about it. Again, playing it down, making it seem like a fringe thing.
Questioning the election results there and using it to further unfounded theories the results of the election could change.
Again, unfounded theories, just dropping those adjectives over and over and over again, telling you how to think. That is not journalism. That really is propaganda. That's when an outlet has an agenda and they're going to use those adjectives. So they're going to tell you how you're supposed to feel about this story by using those type of adjectives.
The plaintiffs in the suit, including Lulu Friesdat and her team at Smart Elections, which calls itself a nonpartisan election reform group.
Again, Smart Elections, which calls itself a nonpartisan election reform group, calls itself is, again, gaslighting you. We are a nonpartisan election reform group, and we've been established for 5 years, and we have 501c3 status, and our work has been featured in a lot of mainstream media, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in Newsweek. For NBC to say something like we call ourselves a nonpartisan election reform group, again, it's gaslighting.
Say they want a full recount in Rockland County, an hour north of New York City, citing alleged irregularities with some districts that logged hundreds of votes for Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, but zero for then Vice President Kamala Harris.
Okay, now this is where they're actually factually inaccurate. So what they say here is that we cited these districts where Harris had 0 votes and Gillibrand had hundreds of votes. And in fact, we don't cite those districts in the lawsuit. The districts are covered as part of Rockland County, but we didn't specifically cite those districts. And I told them that more than once in the course of the interview. So they were very aware of this because they asked me about the 0 Harris districts. And I think a lot of people know about that by now. But if you don't, you can definitely find that on our website. If you go to lawsuits, there are examples of the districts where Kamala Harris got 0 votes and Kirsten Gillibrand, the Democratic senator candidate, got hundreds of votes. But we did not even know about those districts when we filed the lawsuit, and those districts are not cited in the lawsuit. The lawsuit basically has 2 pieces of evidence that it puts forward. It talks about the Senate candidate, Diane Sayer, and how we have affidavits showing that her results were counted inaccurately. And the lawsuit also cites the drop-off in Rockland County where Trump has an overperformance and Harris has an underperformance. And that drop-off is very remarkable. With Trump, it's 23% as we calculated it. And with Harris, it's minus 9%. 9% of her vote is below the Democratic Senate candidate. And I went over all of that with them during the interview. Did they use that? No, they are using something that is not even cited in the lawsuit, and they're saying that it is cited in the lawsuit. So in this particular part of the gaslighting, they are factually inaccurate.
And the narrative in 2020 is that in 2020, the Stop the Steal people said this absolutely happened. The election was absolutely rigged. We're not saying that. We're saying that the results look unusual, irregular, and we would like some hand counts to look into it.
Now, as I said, this is the only part of the interview that they carried, was the part where I said, we're not saying the election was rigged.
Experts say the results have common explanations. One political science professor at MIT calls the case a nothing burger, saying the ticket splitting there was not unique, while also pointing out how those on social media can, quote, glom onto fringe theories.
Again, using this type of language, fringe theories. Now, this report from Charles Stewart is, in fact, a nothing burger. And prior to going into the interview, I actually did a Substack where I went through this Substack that he did piece by piece. And there is just nothing to it. It is really like a drive-by hit on us with very little to show for it. This is on our Substack, and I encourage you to go and read it yourself. It's like our latest one called Answering the Critics. And there's a number of things that are really problematic about this critique that the academic Charles Stewart III from MIT did of our Rockland County lawsuit. Now, one of the first things is that he does not even address one of the major parts of the lawsuit, which are these affidavits showing that the Senate race was not counted accurately. And he says in his post, I will set aside the claims about Sayre's missing votes. And as I said in our post, what? You will set aside the claims about Sayre's allegedly missing Senate votes? Sayre's missing votes are one of the two main pillars of the lawsuit. In a debate, when the moderator asks you a question, if you say, I'm going to set aside your question, you're going to lose the debate. Similarly with a lawsuit, if you're going to come out swinging against this lawsuit, I'm setting aside half of your case because I don't feel inclined to discuss it, isn't an impressive argument. And yet that is Charles Stewart's first part of his Substack, just not dealing with half of the case. Then after that, he goes on to explore what we call the zero Harris districts. They are districts in a particular town in Rockland County where Kamala Harris got 0 votes and Kirsten Gillibrand got hundreds of votes. And Dr. Stewart explains how this is quite likely due to the Hasidic vote in Rockland County. And he points to another county nearby, Orange County, where they also have similar patterns. And also it's a Hasidic community. But what Dr. Stewart neglects to even address is the fact that there are 4 other towns in Rockland County, and those towns have minimal or no Hasidic presence. Those towns are Clarkstown, Haverstraw, Orangetown, and Stony Point. Dr. Stewart does not address those towns in any regard, and yet we have statistical evidence showing that those particular towns that are not Hasidic also have a very strange pattern in them. This analysis by an academic statistician that we're working with shows that when you compare the drop-off in the Democratic Party from 2020 to 2024, it is highly irregular. It comes up with a p-value of 0. And I explained all of this to the NBC correspondent, to the NBC producers. I explained to them what p-value of 0 means. The p-value is the probability or the likelihood. And when you compare 2020 to 2024 Democratic drop-off in all of these towns, the p-value is 0, or in other words, an extremely low likelihood that this result is somehow a natural or random result. There would be some sort of event that happened that would have had to create this type of statistical behavior. Now, we got some pushback that you can't have a p-value of 0. That is not correct. We checked in with Dr. Bonamente, who is guiding us and did the statistical research, and he pointed us to textbook equations that show that you can have a p-value of 0. The p-value parameters actually start at 0. So 0 is allowed in the p-value parameters, although it isn't often used. It just means that there's something unusual here. This is a very, very strange result. So Dr. Stewart, in his Substack, does not even deal with this. He never addresses it. And so that's just a huge weakness in his Substack. He doesn't address the SER votes. He doesn't address this statistical analysis. He picks on one small part of the data, which was not even included in the lawsuit. And he bases his entire Substack on that. And that is the expert that NBC is quoting. Now, on top of that, there's another flaw in his analysis. He goes on to say that there's no way that the software could have been manipulated because the software in the two counties that he compared, which were Rockland County and Orange County, is from two different vendors. One is running ES&S and one is running Dominion. And he says that's just an obvious indication that the software couldn't possibly have been compromised. And it's not correct. The fact of the matter is that there were software updates for both Dominion and ES&S. There were software updates throughout the year for both vendors. There were actually 21 software updates from ProVNV, and they went to both of the vendors. And I show examples in our Substack. I show these examples of a software update that went to all of these different versions of ES&S systems. This is DS200, DS300, EVS 5.2.4.0, EVS 6.0, EVS 6.0.2, 6.0.4, 6.0.4.3. The point of that is that this is most of the ES&S voting machines around the country had software updates like this. And then there are also software updates to most of the Dominion systems, Democracy Suite 5.5B, 5.5C, 5.5D, 5.17. Those are most of the Dominion systems in use. And so for Professor Stewart to just say that he literally says that the claim that this minor software patch to voting machines could have facilitated a targeted manipulation of votes in New York and elsewhere is implausible on its face. The fact that Orange County uses a different voting equipment manufacturer should put to rest the idea that these discrepancies were due to software upgrades. That is just completely in opposition to the facts. The fact of the matter, as I said, is that software updates went to ES&S and Dominion systems both, and therefore we must take into consideration the possibility that there were software malware issues. And one of the things that I do point out also is that Professor Stewart is a political scientist, but he is not an election security expert. And his dismissal of this very serious threat is inappropriate at best and dangerous at worst. So that is our pushback on the expert that NBC is quoting in their piece. So I'm just going to keep going with the NBC piece, and I will continue to point out some of the other problems with it.
The Rockland County Board of Elections calls the lawsuit unfounded, says the election included required post-election audits, and that certain districts have historically demonstrated a tendency for voters to choose individual candidates over party lines. The board believes this case will be dismissed.
I think it remains to be seen if the case is going to be dismissed. They have filed a motion to dismiss, and we are in the process of responding to that motion to dismiss. I actually thought that was like one of the most objective parts of the piece. They just gave a statement that Rockland County Board of Elections had put forward that I thought was relatively neutral.
Friesdat and other election integrity advocates and hackers have been sounding the alarm over vulnerabilities with voting machines for years. But the lawsuit doesn't provide any evidence of hacking in Rockland County.
And here was a perfect opportunity for them to share some of the security vulnerabilities that I shared with them, but they did not take that opportunity. Instead, they emphasized that the lawsuit doesn't specifically say that the election was hacked. That's because we're responsible and we don't know whether it was hacked or not. And so we are just asking for the evidence to find out whether or not there was some type of manipulation. Obviously, they're emphasizing that fact that the lawsuit doesn't specifically say that there was a hack. It's really just beating a dead horse and making sure that you know how you're supposed to think about this story.
And there's no evidence of hacking ever changing votes in an election anywhere in the country. But that isn't stopping the chatter online.
This could be the domino that falls and opens up the whole thing to the rest of the country.
And let's remember, none of the 62 suits Donald Trump filed in 2020 changed the outcome of any race, with the court throwing most out immediately.
That's really ironic that they're citing that, because one of the first things they said to me when I sat down in the interview with them was like, wow, this lawsuit has already gotten a lot further than any of the Trump lawsuits. I said, I believe that that's true, but of course they didn't mention that.
But just because Mr. Trump failed in the courts doesn't mean he failed to convince some supporters. Look at the January 6th attack on the Capitol, set up in part to stop the certification of the results, with 147 Republicans in Congress voting that day to not certify the election. The misguided distrust lingers.
There you go again. Those are your gaslighting words. The misguided distrust. Misguided. If you think these things, you are misguided. It is just gaslight, gaslight, gaslight.
As part of Trump's political movement. That same poll we showed earlier reveals 70% of Trump voters still believe Biden didn't legitimately win in 2020. Now, some Democratic voters may be going down a similar road, even if the party's leaders are not.
And we often talk and hear about this divide within the Democratic Party. Which direction should they go in? Is it more to the left? Is it more to the center as they try and rebuild after those 2024 losses? But this apparent election denialism coming from a significant chunk of the Democratic Party, despite their elected leaders saying the opposite, is yet another potential fracture point that we're watching very closely within the party heading in to the 2026 midterms and beyond.
And, you know, I really enjoyed meeting Julie and really enjoyed speaking with her. But again, in this particular stand-up that she's doing at the end, what she's saying there is, watch out, Democrats, this is a fracture. So if you continue to think these things, if you continue to say these things, you are hurting your own party. You're fracturing your party. So again, it's just point after point to try to discourage people from having these thoughts, asking these questions, taking these types of actions.
Back to you.
So that is my analysis of the NBC interview. I want to say one more thing about why I think it's likely that the broadcast media is just absolutely incapable of covering this issue fairly. And that is because they are really captured at this point. The FCC, which is responsible for regulating the networks and licensing their affiliates, is controlled by Republicans right now. And one of the things that I dug up, which is so fascinating, this is a document from the FCC, which talks about that. You know, it says, whenever we look at an application, whether to build, modify, renew, or sell a station, we must determine if granting it would serve the public interest. Now, if the Republicans decide that the networks are not in the public interest, it is possible that they could make their business very difficult. And one of the things that many people aren't aware of, it's actually kind of buried and hard to find, but the affiliates pay the networks in order to run their content. This is on a website called videoageinternational.net. And it's an expert here talking about the affiliates paying the networks. So it says, I believe it began around the mid to late 2000s, and likely all affiliates were paying the networks for their affiliations by approximately 2012 to 2015. So what you see there is that the FCC is the one that is allowed to say whether an affiliate can open its station or not. And the affiliates are a big source of income to the network. So you can see a direct line there between the FCC and the network's bottom line. And then in addition to that, you can see that the FCC is really starting to lean on the networks and take advantage of that. So here you have the current federal commission's chair, Brendan Carr, a Republican, actually already threatened news outlets owned by Comcast, which includes NBC, and suggested the company's licensed operations could be in jeopardy because of its immigration coverage. That licensed operations is, I believe, a direct reference to their affiliates, that they could kill their affiliates and thereby kill a lot of their income. And then you can see pushback from the Democrats saying that openly threatening to punish Comcast is government retaliation against protected speech. It's dangerous, authoritarian, and wrong. So, you can say it's dangerous, authoritarian, and wrong, but it's happening. And because that's happening, that is one of the reasons that I believe that it is really impossible for the networks to cover this issue impartially right now. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lack of impartiality, as I said, gaslighting and very slanted coverage. And you're seeing somewhat different coverage from the print media, which isn't under the thumb of the FCC in that way. For example, Newsweek has been covering the issue pretty objectively, and we've been featured in Newsweek about 5 times now. You can find all of that on our website at smartelections.us. And if you just go to featured in the news there, that'll take you to the news section. And then as long as you're on our website, I really implore you, please make a donation. We have so much more to do. We have raised the initial money necessary for our lawsuit, but the lawsuit is continuing to be expensive. We have to continue to pay our attorney. We are in the process of sending them another $25,000 retainer to fend off this motion to dismiss. So please, please continue to donate. We are now trying to expand our work, and we are rolling out the next program that we have, which is the election protection program to protect the midterm elections. This is so important. And there's information about that on our homepage. We are going to be at Netroots Nation on August 8th with our first training session for election protection. Please, please do make a donation. We are just immensely grateful for everything you're doing and for that financial support. And now what I want to do is I want to share some information of what I had hoped the interview would be like, and discuss the things that they discussed with me when they interviewed me, and that made me hopeful that it might be a really useful moment for us to look at these issues together. So the first thing that I want to show you is some of what brought me to the point that I am, why I am so skeptical about the election results, and why I think it's so important that we solve some of these problems. And what happened was in 2004, I started filming a documentary, which I directed, produced, edited, and released in 2008. And that documentary was about why more people don't vote and participate in politics. I shared that with them. They said they were interested in watching it. I'm going to show you a little bit of that documentary. And so you start to understand how I came to be interested in election security. I was interviewing people who didn't vote. And then some of the things that they talked to me about kind of pushed me in this direction. So here's the opening from the documentary that I directed. The film is called Holler Back, Not Voting in an American Town. And you can find the entire film if you want to watch it at hollerbackfilm.com.
I've never voted.
We don't vote. We don't vote.
It's deliberate choice. I haven't felt that anyone was worth voting for.
I really don't think my voice counts. I really think it's up to other people.
I've always wanted to vote.
Do you feel like if somebody did reach out to you and have a conversation or a series of conversations with you, that it would make a difference to the way that you feel?
I don't know. Nobody's ever done it, I guess.
People who vote tend to think of people who don't vote like this.
They're idiots. Too lazy, too stupid, too ignorant.
But my experience is that not voting is more likely to be a deliberate decision, a boycott of a process that has failed them.
I don't think we have a democracy. I don't think it's enforced.
And of public officials that they don't trust or respect.
There's so much corruption.
I mean, you could drive through any big city in the country and you can see that there's still people living and they have nothing. And these guys are sitting fat, smoking their $200 cigars, getting their $1,000 haircuts.
So as I did these interviews with people who didn't vote, people would say to me that they didn't believe the results of the election. I would hear that, and I wanted to investigate that. I went and I started filming pieces of information that would help me answer that question. But here's one of the voters that I spoke to who said she didn't believe the election results.
Lower level of trust in our leadership that at least any time in my lifetime.
They all say the same thing, and then when they get to office, you don't really see a big change.
It's understandable that people are alienated. They don't have sufficient cash to get in the conversation and have it heard beyond the fictional, I understand, of any given politician. And unfortunately, that kind of political alienation leads to a kind of political despair.
Who even knows if our votes are even counted?
So that was the question that really sent me on this 20-year research journey. It was a voter, Wendy. She had voted once. She was 34 years old, and then she wasn't ever going to vote again. She was so disappointed in what happened. And she said to me, who even knows if our votes are counted? And I was like, are they? Is there some sort of evidence that the votes are counted accurately? And I found out that these 2 grad students at Princeton had gotten a hold of a U.S. voting machine, which generally you're not supposed to be able to get a hold of them because they're proprietary. It's secret what goes on inside the voting machines. But they had gotten a hold of one, and I heard they had hacked it. And so I reached out to them, and I went to Princeton, and I filmed them. And in this clip, you'll see what happened there.
There's a lot at stake. Control of the American government, control of the economy, control of the military. When there's a lot at stake, there's an incentive to fraud. The difference between our history of fraud and computerized fraud is that with computerized fraud, you can set up a program that basically gives you the number of votes you need, switches, deletes, adds, without leaving a trace. Computer professionals pretty much agree that the system is tremendously vulnerable.
I'm Alex Halderman. I'm a graduate student at Princeton University.
I'm Ari Feldman, and I'm also a graduate student at Princeton University. My interests are computer security and technology policy. This machine has 2 locks, one that covers both the power switch and the memory card slot. And the memory card slot is really all that's needed to introduce malicious software on the machine.
All someone would need is access to one of these machines for 1 minute.
Alex over here, who has modest locksmithing skills, is able to pick it in under 10 seconds.
So that was very hard. This machine has already been infected with our vote stealing software, and there won't be any signs in the pre-election testing that the machine is infected. Now we're ready to run our election. This is the race for President of the United States. The candidates are George Washington and Benedict Arnold.
They walked me through the election.
And so we can cast a vote for George Washington, and then press next.
I'm going to cast my vote for George Washington as well. And again, George Washington, father of our country. I think I favor him over most notorious traitor. And, all right, so
now we have 3 votes for George Washington?
That's right. The total so far is 3 votes for George Washington, no votes for Benedict Arnold. Now election day is over. We're going to end the election and print out the totals. And we see the total: 1 vote for George Washington, 2 votes for Benedict Arnold. How did this happen? Our demonstration vote-stealing software running inside the machine switched 2 of the votes from George Washington to Benedict Arnold. It switched all of the records, so there's no way to go back now and find out that the actual result was 3 votes for George.
The Diebold AccuVote TS voting machine that the Princeton team hacked is an earlier version of the machines currently in use in Allentown.
Now, I'm just going to come in here. I want to just make note, I made this film in 2008, and those machines are no longer running in Pennsylvania. There's some equally bad machines running in Pennsylvania, but not these machines anymore, just so you know, to be totally straight.
I'm Levi Price. I'm the Chief of Staff at Lehigh County.
And you were the one who purchased the new Diebold voting machines.
I was involved in the purchasing. When we looked at those, we looked at the possibility of tampering. We changed the passwords for each election.
The password didn't stop us for more than a few seconds.
One, you have to have the technological capability of altering the software.
The memory card is just a standard off-the-shelf memory card that you use in your digital camera. The smart cards you can buy over the internet.
We have 700 separate machines. Each of those 700 separate machines is locked with a different key.
You don't need to break all 700 locks. Because a viral attack is possible, all you need to do is infect one or a small number of machines. And then the virus and your malicious vote-stealing software will spread from machine to machine during normal election procedures.
But what if we had a paper trail for the touchscreen machines? Would that make them more reliable?
There is no reason to trust a touchscreen or DRE system with or without a paper trail, period. You can hack the paper trails as easily as you can the internal numbers. Matt Bishop is one of the foremost experts in the world on computer security.
Many of the vulnerabilities can be exploited in a very straightforward manner.
Meaning it's not too hard.
Meaning it's not hard at all.
So I just want to say here, they talked about how if you have a DRE, that's a direct record electronic system, and you have a paper trail attached to it, it actually doesn't really increase your security that much because you can change the paper trail. And you remember I said there's a different type of voting machine in Pennsylvania now. One of the types in use in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, where I know Election Truth Alliance has found, particularly unusual data. The Philadelphia voting machines are basically a DRE with a paper trail attached. It's called a hybrid machine, but it's sort of exactly what they're describing. It takes the election results and you do everything on the computer, and then it prints them onto this little slip of paper that's kind of like a cash register receipt, but it counts the vote with a barcode, and the barcode is totally programmable. So just to say, even though it's been 20 years, basically, the voting machines have changed, but not necessarily improved. All that history is so fascinating because when we see that these things are happening over and over again, to me, it makes it more urgent for us to try finally come to terms with this, to finally do something to make sure that our elections are secure and accurate. But I do just want to show you one more clip. One of the other things that I talked to NBC about that I was so hoping that they were going to discuss was the corruption historically in our election process. We are told that our elections are perfect and there's never any fraud really, and that everything is above board. That's just not true. U.S. elections are just filled with a history of corruption and cheating and just all kinds of trouble, all kinds of problems. And so I want you to just learn a little bit about one of the worst cases of corruption in U.S. presidential history, and that's the election from 1876 between Hayes and Tilden. And we actually interviewed an expert on this, Professor Ed Foley, who's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about that election. And we used to have a podcast that would air every couple of weeks, and we had some great people on there. And so I'm just going to play that interview for you because it's fascinating. And then I did tag one more little clip on the end of that was not from our show that I got on C-SPAN because it was just, again, so reminiscent of what's happening now. It's fascinating to me. And so the clip at the end was not from our show, but from C-SPAN. And I want you to see this interview about the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876. Pleasure now to bring on Professor Edward V. Foley, and to have him here with us. Do you want to just introduce yourself and say a little bit about your work?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you. I teach election law. I've been fortunate to be at Ohio State for many years now, and it's been a great home. Ohio has been a laboratory of democracy and voting issues. We're not quite the battleground that we were.
I like that, laboratory of democracy. A little bit euphemistic there. We've had some definite bumps in Ohio.
Yes, indeed. We've been through the ringer. We feel for Pennsylvania this year, right? We know what it's like to be under the microscope.
A little bit about your background. I know that you also are a contributing columnist at the Washington Post. You had a really interesting article in the Harvard Law Review blog just a few months ago.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of work over the last few years on issues related to recounts and the risk of disputed elections.
The beginning of the story is that the Hayes-Tilden presidential race was contentious and tight, and we were in, similar to what we are in now, a very polarized country. We had just come out of the Civil War.
I never learned about it in high school class or college or anywhere, so I had to discover this for myself, and it's quite an episode in our history that I really think Americans should know about. It's an interesting story. It's kind of riveting drama, but it tells us a lot about ourselves in multiple ways.
I'm going to just pull up some of the text from your actual book on this, and it's so interesting. What you said there was this was like a huge constitutional crisis that developed, basically.
Correct. What happens back in 1876 is that the dispute isn't contained within Florida. You don't get a concession based on the counting of ballots in Florida. Instead, what happens on the date that the electors have to meet, both groups of electors met, claiming that they're the official ones. So the Republicans electors all met in Tallahassee, the state capital, and they voted for Hayes. And they claimed that they were the true electors based on what the Secretary of State said. And then the Tilden electors, the Democrats, also met in Tallahassee on the same day, voted for Tilden, and they had the Attorney General from Florida saying that they were the valid electors.
And what you said in your book also was there was fraud. So in the Republican decision, in deciding their electors, they threw out a bunch of Democratic votes that they didn't want to count and counted a bunch of Republican votes that they wanted to count. And then the Democrats maybe had been more technically accurate about counting the votes, but had blocked Blacks and African Americans from voting, period. So there was really fraud on both sides in that situation. So who was more fraudulent, who was more wrong? Hard to say. But they both sent these two sets of electors to Congress, as did two other states, right? Which other states?
Louisiana and South Carolina were the other southern states where there were similar disputes. And then Oregon also had a dispute that was a little bit different. What happened was the Tilden team, they thought that the Republicans were being fraudulent in the South, like we were just talking about. And they thought they had a trick up their sleeve. They thought, well, if Congress approves the Hayes votes from the South, we can play that game in Oregon, because the governor of Oregon was a Democrat on the Tilden side. So he manufactured just one extra electoral vote out of Oregon in favor of Tilden. And they said, if your theory in the South wins, our theory in Oregon wins. And the Tilden team only needed one more electoral vote of all the disputed votes to reach an electoral college majority. Hayes had to win every single disputed vote in order to prevail. And so that's why there were these 4 states that sent conflicting submissions to Congress to resolve. I think we don't teach it because we're a little embarrassed by it, because with the resolution of that presidential election, we ended Reconstruction. And the end of Reconstruction meant the end of civil rights and voting rights for African Americans in the South. In essence,
there was a deal that went down in order to basically forestall a constitutional crisis. There was some real kind of backroom dealing that went on.
Exactly. Yes, there was a backroom dealing in a hotel room.
It was certainly controversial. Democrats were, of course, furious. They believed Hayes, this was illegitimate. Tilden, for example, throughout this process, was receiving scores and scores of letters urging him to challenge the outcome. Many said, challenge it via the courts. You should sue. Take this to the Supreme Court. And there were many that were pledging violence, writing Tilden, particularly Southerners, writing Tilden saying, if you say the word, we will raise the militia and we will storm Washington, D.C. to make sure that you are installed as president. I think importantly, though, and this is particularly notable given how we saw the last presidential election play out in 2020, and particularly the events of January 6, 2020, Tilden refused to challenge the outcome.
I just thought that was so fascinating, and I thought you would really appreciate all of the parallels there with the disputed election and people writing to Tilden and saying, why didn't you dispute it? Why didn't you dispute it? So I do think that it's so important for us to look at this and understand that what's happening now, it's not anything new. There have been disputed elections historically in the United States. And there have been plenty of hard feelings and plenty of times when people not only felt that the other side was cheating, but were absolutely positive that the other side was cheating. There's actually just plenty of evidence that both sides have cheated historically over and over again. So that's why I say when they're trying to make you feel embarrassed about asking questions or embarrassed to say that you think the election wasn't fair, it really is a kind of gaslighting, and it is really historically uninformed, because in fact, this has taken place in our history, and it is important for us to be aware of that. So I really appreciate you watching, and I really appreciate you following this issue. We really appreciate you. We appreciate all of our supporters. We are going to take just a moment to say, if you could please make a tax-deductible gift today, we would be so tremendously grateful. And the way you do that is just by going to our website, smartelections.us, and clicking on donate. Please do give whatever you can afford. It is tax-deductible, and we are just immensely grateful for everything you're doing and for that financial support. So please stay tuned. More to come. I guess, as Recognizance says, stay positive and just remember, you're not crazy.